All right, let's take a look at a normative theory, a theory about right and wrong. In the first unit of the course, we looked at a theory of the good. Hedonism was one attempt to give a philosophical answer to this question, what is good? That is to say, what is the good? What is the source of all value? What is it that makes all particular good things good? Ethics basically comes down to those two questions, what is good and what is right. And in the first unit of the course, when we were looking at a value theory, a theory of value, hedonism, we were focused on that question to do with the nature of goodness. In this unit of the course, we're focusing on the question, what is right? That is to say, what is the right? That's the way that the question is sometimes put in philosophical terms, because we're not asking, here again, just as we said with respect to the issue of what is the good. In this case, we're not asking for examples of particular right acts, although we will see in this unit of the course that looking at examples is important. But we want to try to identify a principle that would help us to make ethical judgments. Just giving examples doesn't exactly work, because if you don't agree, or if it's not clear to you in some cases why such and such act is the right act, then to just give you an example doesn't really help. We need to go beyond particular examples and try to identify the principle on the basis of which we make moral judgments. Try to, if we can, identify some fundamental principle or some fundamental set of rules on the basis of which we could make all particular moral judgments. And if you could do that, then you know how to apply such a principle to particular cases. And you have a principled basis for saying, I know, or I have good reason to believe, or I have justification for believing that in this particular case, X would be the right act, or in this particular case, Y would be a morally wrong act. We want to try to identify some normative principle, some principle of the nature of right itself. How in general ought I to act? That's what we mean here by what is the right. Here again, not what is a particular example of a morally right act, but how in general ought I to act? What principled basis can I have for knowing how to make ethical decisions, how to make ethical judgments? That's the focus of this unit of the course. And the first normative theory that we're looking at is Utilitarianism. Schaefer-Landau titles this chapter Consequentialism, Its Nature and Attractions. But after he briefly explains the consequentialist principle, then he goes on to say that we're just going to focus on one version of consequentialism, namely utilitarianism. So that's really going to be our focus in this unit of the course, or rather that along with another normative theory, the Kantian normative theory. So in this unit of the course, we're going to take a look at the utilitarian normative theory and the Kantian normative theory. And so we're starting with utilitarianism. We're going to take a look right now at this chapter in which Schaefer-Landau presents arguments on behalf of utilitarianism. And then next time we'll take a look at a chapter in which he presents arguments against consequentialism. And then next week we'll take a look at a couple of chapters on another normative theory, another theory of the right, namely Kantian normative theory. But let's start off with this term, consequentialism. It's simply the principle that an action is morally required just because it produces the best overall results. So the act that produces the best consequences, the act that produces the best results, the best overall results, or the best overall consequences, that is the right act, according to this ethical theory, according to this normative theory. But now, how is best to be understood here? Best results, best consequences understood how? We need a more specific philosophical thesis. If I'm looking at all the different consequences, all the different results of a particular act, or if I'm comparing the results of two acts, how do I know which set of consequences, which set of results is the better set? We have to have some value theory, right, on the basis of which to make that judgment. What should count as good or better or best results? So the principle of utility provides us with a version of consequentialism in which there's a substantive answer to that question: how should we understand best results? How should we understand good or better or best results? The principle of utility says that an action is morally required just because it does more to improve overall well-being than any other action you could have done in the circumstances. So in a circumstance, a number of possible courses of action are available to you. You look at the different options, and you think about what will be the consequences, what will be the results of action X and action Y and action Z. And then you compare the results, and the set of results that does the most to improve overall well-being is going to be the morally right act. So Schaeffer-Landau explains briefly this term consequentialism, which just means that the right act is the one that produces the best overall consequences or results. Then he goes on to discuss act utilitarianism. He starts off talking about a distinction between two versions of utilitarianism, namely act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. But then as soon as he explains that distinction, he goes on to say in this chapter, we're just going to focus on act utilitarianism. So here again, going forward, I'm just going to be using the term utilitarianism for what, strictly speaking, is act utilitarianism, one version of it. But that's the only version that we're going to consider in connection with this chapter. So utilitarianism is a specific version of consequentialism. Any version of consequentialism says that the right act is the one that produces the best overall consequences, the best overall results. And then act utilitarianism makes the more specific claim that the right act is the one that produces the best overall consequences, where best consequences is understood as the consequences that do the most to promote well-being. Okay, so now we're starting to get a little bit more into the substance of the view. So one way to understand the utilitarian thesis would be to put it like this: what you ought to do is to maximize good consequences. Okay, maximize good consequences. Well, how is good to be understood? Well, on the basis of hedonism. Hedonism is the value theory on which utilitarianism as a normative theory is based. I mentioned this point when we were talking about John Stuart Mill's ideas, when we were reading those selections from Mill. I did mention that Mill's value theory, hedonism, was also the basis of his normative theory, his theory about what is right. Again, what in general is the right thing to do as a matter of principle. How ought you to act? How ought you to make ethical decisions? We've seen that here again, Mill's value theory was hedonism, and then utilitarianism is a normative theory that's based on that theory of value. So utilitarianism calls on us to maximize pleasure/happiness and minimize pain/unhappiness. So the right act is always the one that maximizes pleasure or happiness, or, of course, in some circumstances, there are going to be bad consequences no matter what you do. So in that kind of circumstance, the right act is the one that minimizes pain or minimizes unhappiness. That's the basic utilitarian principle. Do what will maximize good consequences or minimize bad consequences. Where good is understood as, here again, pleasure or happiness, bad is understood as pain or unhappiness. So we see here that utilitarianism as a normative theory is based on hedonism as a value theory. So that's the thesis, and in this chapter, Schaeffer-Landau considers a number of considerations that seem to point to the plausibility, the believability of utilitarianism as a normative theory. He touches on several considerations that seem to argue on behalf of utilitarianism being the correct normative view, the correct theory of right. He starts off discussing the emphasis that utilitarianism puts on impartiality. And at least at first glance, that does seem like a strength of the theory. because from the moral point of view, it seems like everyone is on a par. That is to say, everyone's interests must be given consideration. And utilitarianism does well by that measure, because the utilitarian principle is that the right act is the one that maximizes good consequences, with every sentient being affected by the act being counted equally. So everyone affected by the act has to be considered equally. And when I say everyone, not only every person, but here again, every sentient being. What is a sentient being? Well, human beings are sentient beings. Sentient means having the capacity to experience pleasure and pain. Strictly speaking, it's having the capacity to experience sensation. But for our purposes in discussing this ethical theory, what that mainly comes down to is having the capacity to experience pleasure or pain, because as we've seen, utilitarianism is based on the value theory, hedonism, and hedonism says that the one intrinsic good is pleasure or happiness, the one intrinsic bad is pain or unhappiness. So what are other sentient beings besides human beings? Well, animals, or at least some animals. Most animals are sentient. Most animals are capable of experiencing pleasure and pain. And utilitarianism says here again, the right act is the one that maximizes good consequences, with every sentient being affected by the act being counted equally. So on this view, animals, because they are capable of experiencing pleasure and pain, animals have a certain moral status in this theory. Utilitarianism attaches a certain moral status to animals. How an act is going to affect them in terms of pleasure or pain, how an act is going to affect animals has to be taken into consideration. If an act is going to have painful consequences for animals, that's a relevant consideration on this view. That fact has to be taken into account on this view. Every sentient being has moral status. One way that this point is sometimes put is to say that every sentient being is within the scope of the moral community. That is to say, when you're thinking about the consequences of your action, you have to think about the consequences as they will affect every sentient being. So, on this view, animals are in the moral community. Animals fall within the scope of beings that we have to consider when we're considering the consequences of our actions. So, as I said a moment ago, at least at first glance, this emphasis on impartiality does seem to be a strength of utilitarianism. On page 127, Schaefer-Landau puts the point this way. Utilitarianism is a doctrine of impartiality, and this is one of its great strengths. It tells us that the welfare of each person is equally morally valuable. Okay, that seems true. He goes on to say, whether rich or poor, white or black, male or female, religious or not, your well-being is just as important as anyone else's. Okay. So that seems true. That seems simply a point of moral common sense, doesn't it? I don't think we would accept any moral principle that laid down a different way of treating, say, for example, a white person from a black person, or a rich person from a poor person, just to follow Schaefer-Landau's list here, or a man from a woman, in terms of their, here again, moral status, or a religious person from a not religious person, right? We wouldn't accept as a matter of principle X is a morally wrong thing to do except for whites, say, for example, they may do it, something like that. Or X is morally wrong to do except for blacks, or except for men, or except for women, right? We wouldn't accept any moral principle that, here again, gave one group a partial consideration, took their well-being to be more important than members of any other group. So that simply seems like moral common sense, and for that reason this emphasis on impartiality does seem like a strong point. At least at first glance it seems like a strong point of utilitarianism as a normative theory. Another consideration that seems to support the believability of utilitarianism as a theory of right is what Schaefer-Landau calls its ability to justify conventional moral wisdom. In some ways, it seems to match up with our common sense moral intuitions, just our moral common sense, pretty well. It seems like when you think about a lot of ethical dilemmas in which you might find yourself, it seems like you would decide what to do by weighing the consequences of the different possible courses of action, and then choosing the act that would maximize the good consequences or would minimize the bad consequences. It seems like that's how we would resolve a lot of moral conflicts. So, at least at first glance, utilitarianism seems to get the right answer in a lot of cases. It seems like that is how we would decide. Schaefer-Landau says that, I'm paraphrasing here, but the idea is that the kinds of acts that commonly are considered right are acts that tend to promote good consequences. And the kinds of acts that commonly are considered wrong are acts that tend to promote bad consequences. Utilitarianism would seem to explain why our conventional moral beliefs are what they are. So it has been seen as a strength of utilitarianism that it does seem to match up with our moral common sense pretty well. I think that in a lot of ethical dilemmas, that is how we would decide. We would look at the good and the bad consequences of each available course of action and weigh the consequences and either try to maximize good consequences or minimize bad consequences. It seems like that's how we would decide seems like that's how we would resolve a lot of dilemmas. And it seems like, at least in some of the time, that's the right thing to do. So what would be an example? I think of an example from the submarine movie, Crimson Tide, the submarine movie with Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington some years back. This was back in the 90s, but Denzel Washington is in command of a submarine, and it engages in combat with a Russian sub and suffers some damage. And one compartment of the submarine is filling with water, and if that compartment of the submarine isn't sealed, then the whole submarine will be flooded, and the submarine will sink, and everyone will die. Now, there are some sailors in that compartment trying to stop the flooding, trying to stop the water coming in. But the compartment is filling up with water very fast, and there isn't enough time to get those sailors out of, those submariners out of that compartment and seal the compartment before the water starts to flood into the rest of the submarine. There's only enough time to do one or the other. Seal the compartment knowing that the sailors in that compartment will die, or try to get them out but risk the water then surging into the rest of the submarine, sinking the whole submarine, and everybody dies. So in that moral dilemma, Denzel Washington makes the painful decision to give the order to seal that compartment of the submarine, knowing that the sailors in that compartment are going to die. But he reasons that that is the act, to put it in utilitarian terms here, his reasoning is that that is the act that will minimize bad consequences. A certain number of people are going to die either way. The course of action that he chooses minimizes the number of deaths. The course of action that he chooses minimizes the loss of life. So there are going to be bad consequences either way in that case. It seems like in that case, he did the right thing. A certain number of people were going to die either way. At least he minimized the loss of life. Or I guess you could say he maximized good consequences by saving at least some of the lives as compared to the other course of action, which would have amounted to saving none of the lives, losing all the lives, everyone on the submarine. So that's one example that comes to mind for me, and I'm sure you can think of a lot of examples of this kind. It seems like oftentimes we do resolve an ethical dilemma by weighing the consequences of the different possible courses of action and trying to maximize happiness, or where that's not possible, at least minimize pain or unhappiness. So utilitarianism seems to do a good job of justifying conventional moral wisdom. at least some of the time. We'll raise a critical question about this next time, but at least some of the time it does seem to get the right answer. Elaborating on this point, Schaefer-Landau writes on page 128, consider the things we regard deep down as seriously immoral: slavery, rape, humiliating defenseless people, killing innocent victims. Each of these clearly tends to do more harm than good. Okay, so let's think of all those examples. Slavery, does that tend to maximize good or bad consequences? Seems to maximize bad consequences. We tend to think that that's wrong, and so utilitarianism gets the right answer here. The act that maximizes bad consequences is the act that we call the wrong act. And you could say the same here about the rest of Schaefer-Landau's examples here. And then he goes on to say, now consider the things we strongly believe to be morally right: helping the poor, keeping promises, telling the truth, bravely facing danger. Okay, so let's think about those examples. Helping the poor, does that tend to maximize good consequences? Does that tend to promote a greater overall balance of good over bad consequences? Yes, it does. We also think that that is a morally right thing to do. So here again, you go through that list of examples that Schaefer-Landau gives there, and it seems like utilitarianism does deliver the right answer. So at least some of the time it seems to match up with common sense pretty well, and that's why many people have found it a plausible ethical theory. Another consideration that seems to lend support to utilitarianism as the theory of right is this point that Schaefer-Landau makes about conflict resolution, its ability to resolve ethical conflicts, moral conflicts, conflicts of interest. Schaefer-Landau writes, when there are conflicting interests, that is to say, any available course of action will result in some harm, utilitarianism provides reasonably clear guidance. The right course of action is the one that will bring about the greatest balance of happiness over unhappiness. So on page 129 he gives an example. Consider this familiar moral puzzle. I overhear some nasty gossip about my friend. She later asks me whether people have been spreading rumors about her. I know that she is extremely sensitive, and that if I answer honestly, it will send her into a downward spiral for several days. I also know that the source of this gossip is someone who actually likes my friend and was acting impulsively and out of character. She's probably feeling bad about it already and probably won't repeat this unkindness. He goes on to say, in this case, the utilitarian will advise me not to reveal what I have heard. So a little further down he says, when we consider our options, utilitarians tell us to pick the one that increases overall well-being. Telling the truth won't always do that. And then as he goes on to point out, utilitarianism thus gives us a clear method for resolving moral conflict. We can apply the principle of utility to determine which choice to make in difficult cases. So in this example, there's going to be some harm either way, right? There's going to be harm if you tell the truth. Let me start that again. If you don't tell your friend the truth, then there's going to be harm to the conventional moral rule. The conventional moral rule in this case is that one ought to tell the truth. If you do that in this case, is that going to increase overall well-being? Well, Schaefer-Landau argues that in this case, and a lot of people would agree that in this case, adhering to the conventional moral rule is not going to do that. It's not going to increase overall well-being. In this case, it seems like what would increase overall well-being would be to not tell the truth. Now, if you tell the truth, then, of course, the conventional moral rule won't be harmed. The conventional moral rule to tell the truth won't be harmed. But your friend's feelings will be hurt, and that will be a kind of harm. So there's a conflict here. There's a conflict of interest. We care about the conventional moral rule, tell the truth, but we also care about people's feelings. So there are conflicting interests in this case. Either course of action, tell the truth or don't tell the truth, is going to result in some harm. Well, a strength of utilitarianism is that it does provide reasonably clear guidance about what you should do in such a dilemma. The right course of action is the one that will bring about the greatest balance of happiness over unhappiness. So it seems like in this case, at least Schaefer-Landau argues, and I think a lot of people would agree with him, that in this case, the act that would bring about the greatest balance of happiness over unhappiness is not to reveal to your friend what you heard, not to tell her the truth. So you may or may not agree with that, but it certainly is the case that utilitarianism provides clear guidance. It does give a clear answer to what to do in such a dilemma. Now, you may not agree with what it tells you to do. That's a further question, obviously. But it does do a good job of giving, as Schaefer-Landau says, again, reasonably clear guidance about how to resolve a conflict, about how to resolve a dilemma. It does do that. And that has seemed to a lot of people to be a strength of utilitarianism. Another strength, arguably, of utilitarianism is its moral flexibility. Most of us would think that there are some cases in which it would be right to break conventional moral rules. Utilitarianism permits us to do so and explains why it is right to do so. So to go back to the previous example, most people think that it would be right in some cases to lie. If it were necessary to lie to save someone's life from criminals, say, for example, I think most people would believe that that's the morally right thing to do. And utilitarianism, as Schaefer-Landau says, utilitarianism permits us to do that. So this emphasis on moral flexibility does seem to be a strength of the theory. Schaefer-Landau gives an example. This is on page 130 of the Fundamentals of Ethics. He says, during the winter of 1846-1847, members of the Donner Party, traveling by horse and coach in search of a pass through California's Sierra Nevada range, found themselves buried in heavy mountain snows. It wasn't long before their supplies of food and fuel ran out. Almost half of the 87 members of the party died that winter. Some of those who survived faced a terrible choice. They could starve to death or remain alive by eating the remains of their fellow travelers. In the choice faced by members of the Donner Party, one might regard the prohibition on eating human flesh as absolute, not to be violated under any conditions. Even though honoring the rule means losing one's life, some rules are never to be broken. Well, utilitarians would disagree, and their disagreement is based on very general grounds. For utilitarians, no moral rule other than the principle of utility is absolute. It is morally okay to violate any rule, even one that prohibits cannibalism or torture or the killing of innocents, if doing so will raise overall well-being. So it's a conventional moral rule, certainly, that one should never eat human flesh. Pretty much I think everyone would agree with that. But utilitarianism does permit us to break the rules in some cases. And I think a lot of people looking at this dilemma of people in the Donner Party resort to eating the flesh of the travelers who died, resort to eating the remains of the fellow travelers, or starve to death. I think a lot of people looking at that dilemma would say that if it's a matter of avoiding starving to death, then one is morally justified in breaking the conventional rule. Utilitarianism would here again say no moral rule, other than the principle of utility itself. No rule is absolute. Here again, you are just on this view, you are justified in breaking a conventional moral rule if that is necessary to maximize good consequences. In that case, there were going to be bad consequences either way. If somebody in that circumstance adheres to the rule and chooses not to eat the remains of his fellow travelers, and then starves to death, of course, the bad consequence is going to be that that person has now starved to death. If the person chooses to adhere to the rule, there's going to be a good consequence. That person will not starve to death. The bad consequence is that one has violated a conventional moral rule, but it seems clear to many that in this case, violating the conventional moral rule is clearly what would bring about the greatest overall balance of good consequences over bad consequences. At least some lives would be saved in that case, as opposed to no lives being saved. So that's the dilemma, and utilitarianism says in that case one ought to, here again, do what will maximize good consequences. And in that case, I think an awful lot of people would agree that that was the right thing to do, or at least would not deny that that was a morally justified thing to do. As I said a moment ago, utilitarians give the most importance in terms of capacity, in terms of moral status, to the capacity for sensation, that is to say, sentience. For utilitarians, the moral community is defined by sentience, again, the capacity for sensation. Because only pain is intrinsically bad, any being that can experience pain has moral status. We must calculate good and bad consequences by taking into account the effects of our action on every sentient being. So, on the utilitarian view, animals, for example, do have a certain moral status because animals are sentient. Most animals are sentient, do have the capacity for sensation, and because they have the capacity for sensation, they can experience pain. And on this view, here again, utilitarianism as a normative theory is based on hedonism as a value theory, and as we've seen, hedonism says that the intrinsic good is pleasure or happiness, the intrinsic bad is pain or unhappiness. So when you're deliberating on what to do, you have to calculate the good and bad consequences for each of the courses of action available to you. And you have to calculate those consequences in a way that takes into consideration any consequences that would inflict pain on animals. Here again, those are bad consequences. And those bad consequences have to enter into your calculation, your weighing of good and bad consequences, when you're trying to determine what is the right act. So, as I said earlier, utilitarians do see animals as having a certain moral status, and for that reason they tend to oppose using animals for meat or using animals for scientific experiments. So this is a view that does attach a moral status, does attach moral interests to animals, and a lot of people have found it an appealing view for that reason, people who are already sympathetic to the position that animals have a moral status, and we have a moral obligation to take into consideration the ways that our actions affect them. Somebody who already believes that is likely to find utilitarianism a persuasive normative theory. So, for example, here's one kind of argument that utilitarians would present, an argument against using animals for meat or experiments. The argument would be if it's wrong to inflict unnecessary pain on humans, then it's wrong to inflict unnecessary pain on animals. Second premise, it is wrong to inflict unnecessary pain on humans. Therefore, conclusion, it's wrong to inflict unnecessary pain on animals. That is to say, use them for meat or use them in experiments. This is obviously a valid argument. It's an example of modus ponens. The form of it is if P then Q, P therefore Q. So it's obviously valid. Is it a sound argument? Well, you'll have to decide for yourself whether you believe these premises are true. From the utilitarian point of view, here again, it's clearly wrong to inflict unnecessary pain on humans. And there isn't any fundamental difference between animals and humans in terms of their moral status, because they both have the relevant moral property, that is to say, the property that confers a certain moral status on a being, namely here again sentience, this capacity for pleasure or pain. As Schaefer-Landau puts the point on 132, from the utilitarian perspective, we are not allowed to ignore the suffering of others. It doesn't matter whether the victims are human beings or not. And then a little further down, he points out that harming a human is not in and of itself any worse than causing the same harm to a non-human animal. So that is the utilitarian view. Pain is the only intrinsically bad thing. So it doesn't matter whether the being experiencing the pain is a human or an animal. Both of those are bad consequences from the point of view of the utilitarian calculation of good and bad consequences. Here's a thought experiment that was put forward by a utilitarian philosopher by the name of Nielsen as a way to try to show the correctness of utilitarianism as a normative theory. So it's called the trolley car thought experiment. So imagine this scenario. You're on a trolley car and the brakes fail. There are 5 workmen on the track ahead. There's only one workman on a sidetrack, and there's only enough time to pull the switch for the sidetrack or crash into the 5 ahead. So in a way that's a little bit similar to what I said earlier about the Crimson Tide scenario, there are going to be bad consequences either way. They're going to be painful, unhappy consequences either way. Now, utilitarians argue that the right act is always the one that maximizes good consequences or minimizes bad consequences. In this case, if one pulls the switch for the sidetrack, one person will be killed, but 5 lives will be saved. If one does not, then 5 people will be killed. So from the point of view of the utilitarian normative theory, here again, the fundamental moral principle is maximize good consequences. And it seems like, in this case, pulling the switch so that only 1 workman dies rather than 5, it seems like that is the course of action that seems clear that is the course of action that would maximize good consequences. And a lot of people say that is what they would do. So here again, utilitarianism seems, at least at first glance, to match up pretty well with moral common sense. Utilitarians believe that if you don't turn the car onto the track with only 1 workman, then you're responsible for the deaths of the 5 workmen on the track on which you find yourself when the brakes fail. Utilitarians believe that we are responsible not only for what we do, but for what we allow to happen. They believe that the thought experiment supports utilitarianism because they believe that most people would take the course of action resulting in 1 death rather than allow 5 deaths. And it seems like that contention, it seems like that claim is correct. It seems like that is what most people would do. One course of action here clearly would maximize good consequences. If you pull the switch, only 1 person will die. If you don't pull a switch, 5 people will die. So it seems clear that pulling the switch is the course of action that would minimize pain and unhappiness. 5 people who would have otherwise been killed will not be killed. Now, of course, if you pull the switch, then that does mean that 1 person who otherwise would not have been killed will be killed. So again, there are going to be painful consequences either way. Utilitarians believe here again that you're not only responsible for what you do, but for what you allow to happen. So someone might say in reply to this thought experiment, well, I'm just going to sit there and do nothing because it's not my fault that the brakes failed. And so I don't have an obligation to do anything. Utilitarians would argue that even though it is not your fault that you're in that scenario. Once you're in that scenario, it is the case that there clearly is a course of action that will maximize good consequences and minimize bad consequences, and that course of action is to pull the switch. So they would argue if you do nothing, you are responsible for the 5 deaths. You could have done something that would have prevented those 5 deaths. Yes, it's true. You're not responsible for the fact that you're in that scenario in the first place. The brakes failed through no fault of your own. You just happened to be there. But once you're in that scenario, there clearly, utilitarians would argue that there clearly is a course of action that will minimize pain. There clearly is a course of action that will maximize lives saved. And so if you don't do it, you are morally responsible for the fact that those 5 workmen died. That is the utilitarian view of this thought experiment, and it was put forth by a utilitarian as a way to try to argue, to try to get across the basic correctness, the plausibility of the utilitarian normative theory, because it seems like that is what most people would do in this scenario. According to utilitarians, not to turn the car onto the track with only one person would clearly be wrong, because we are morally responsible for what we allow to happen. And here again, it seems like that is what most people would do. So at least at first glance, it seems like utilitarianism matches up pretty well with moral common sense. And this again is why it has been seen as an appealing and a persuasive normative theory, a persuasive theory of right and wrong to a lot of readers.